One of our favorite annual global tech events, VMworld, went virtual this year and also went big on 5G. Executive Vice President Shekar Ayyar provided a deep insight into what 5G would mean for the cloud and the enterprise. We caught up with him for the Future Fast.
In your keynote at VMworld 2020, you said that 5G would change our world, but we didn't predict how much. So to start with, can you give us the insight into the gap between what you had expected or what was predicted and what is coming to pass?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I may have said this as well, but I do look at 5G akin to the transformation that we went through with the internet and the web in the late 80s, early 90s. And I think there are several aspects of it which are pertinent. One is much like HTTP protocol or the web itself having some sort of protocol dependence on something that was transformational. Really what made the internet a part of everybody's lives on a kind of everyday basis was much more the platforming, the applications, the agility with which people were able to get on and off it. And that made it just pervasive and global. Similarly, I think 5G for a lot of the chased folks ends up being a protocol. It's the transition from 4th generation to 5th generation wireless. But in practice, what is happening is many catalysts are actually coming together and somewhat fortuitously, I would say. So if you look at the combination of wireless and wireline technologies, this time around, people are looking at fiber and optical and wireless and spectrum all in the same vein. If you look at even the infrastructure transition from cloud to edge, there's a lot of activity that's going on in terms of how centralized computing is now going to become much more distributed and towards the edge. If you look at the disaggregation of the communications network, yet again, we now have a transition where it's no longer going to be protocols that are not penetrable, that you actually have places in which people can come in and intersperse their own applications on top of it. So in a sense, I would say if you take these catalysts together, I haven't even talked about things like eSIM and what is happening at the device side. Just the nature of software-driven architectures and the pervasive nature of how they're going to take just simple SIM cards on phones and make it much more, I'd say you could potentially have like 4 carriers on your phone and you could switch between them on an hourly or a minute-by-minute basis. So this just makes it a much more dynamic and agile infrastructure to then go and contemplate what are the applications that can get created, built, and delivered on top. And once again, I think much like the internet, I think everybody, ourselves included, when we think about applications today, we are somewhat constrained by what we know of the past and how that's going to evolve. And so I do think that there are 2 sides to it. One is there's a rich set of current day applications that I think will get transformed as we get into this 5G world. So think about on the consumer side, things like conferencing and communications and video conferencing, things like gaming. These have all been talked about as consumer applications that are going to be rich in bandwidth, require low latency, and the ability to have compute interfaces at close proximity. Then if you think about more, I'd say B2B and enterprise style applications. Once again, if you think about automated industrial automation and IoT-like applications. Or if you start thinking about AI and ML-based delivery of applications and how that problem can get better computed through distributed points. So this is all now a set of things that people know are going to get transformed, and we have just begun the process. But equally, I think there's a whole bunch of things that are unknown. As in, if I were to give you, Arthur, a platform and basically say, go create whatever you can, because you can now access the, I don't know, geolocation information of people in a particular geography, and you can combine that with information around what they are doing from the standpoint of security, and then the information that you have in terms of the priority of their use around different types of applications. Let's just say all of these were available to you as you go as a developer and build your next application. To me, the potential is then immense in terms of what we can do. I mean, it could literally change the face of how people do their retail shopping. It could change the face of how people communicate with their doctors, and it could change the face of how they are, in fact, engaging with their coworkers at work. And that, to me, is the power of what is happening.
That sounds a lot like the language people use when they talk about digital transformation in general. In fact, a line that you use is that 5G will change the way that we work and play, among other things. And that sounds a lot like when people talk about how digital transformation will change the world and is changing the world. So do the two go hand in hand, or does the one support the other, or are they separate trajectories that will coalesce, so to speak, and have an even greater impact on the consumer and the workspace?
I think these, I guess, in a slightly more colloquial use, I would say digital transformation represents a lot of what is already happening and the transformation that is going on today. Okay. So if you think about industries operating where they would like to automate more of what they do, if they would like to make sure that they have remote capabilities to manage and monitor, those types of things I think are underway in what people call as digital transformation today. To me, this next generation of something that's coming along with 5G and potentially even other generations of wireless would almost be the next step in that. And you could kind of look at it as a digital transformation 2.0. And so when we think about this transformation, for example, today, if you look underneath the covers and ask the question of what does it take for your cell phone to communicate to my cell phone, or for you and I to have this chat over our current video link, there are two types of infrastructures that don't particularly meet. One is the telco and communications infrastructure that is resident inside in your case, MTN and Vodacom and so on, or for that matter, AT&T and Verizon and Vodafone. And then another one which resides inside either corporate campuses for their private cloud infrastructure, or Azure and Amazon and Google and clouds like that. And these worlds largely don't meet. People have been optimizing for this world here and for this world here. And so you can get better calls and you can get better productivity applications delivered from the cloud, but you haven't really got the harness the power of these two coming together. So with 5G, you've got a digital transformation happening here, you've got a digital transformation happening here, and you're now sort of coalescing these two things to get the power of the best of these two worlds as you do this in a way in which application providers can create apps that transcend both these clouds, if you will. Simultaneous with that is the notion that you are now going to have a lot more distributed capability of these cloudlets. So if I want the ability to go communicate with a cell tower, today I have to actually look for that tower in some location. Imagine that with 5G, I could now have those points of radio strewn around much closer to me. So a corporate campus like our VMware campus in Palo Alto is about 100 acres. Maybe we have like 5 radios on the VMware campus, and that allows all of us to communicate with our laptops, cell phones, etc., without having to get onto Wi-Fi, is an example, right? And that to me is what is this digital transformation 2.0.
Right. one of the great ironies of what you're saying is that a lot of this will depend on the communication service providers. And as you had mentioned, that this is a chance for them to reinvent themselves. But the very fact that they are not digitally transformed, generally speaking, it suggests that they don't perhaps have the right insight or perspective on how 5G will change the world and what the needs are of that world in terms of harnessing 5G. So first, I'd like to ask your perspective on that statement. You might not agree, but then also how 5G in turn will transform the telecommunication service providers. Will they be forced to digitally transform themselves in order to help the digital transformation of industry at large and of consumers for that matter?
Yeah, no, so I actually agree with your statement. I wouldn't disagree at all, which is the telecommunications industry has historically been slow to adopt digital transformation, has not been anywhere close to being transformed as with the rest of the infrastructure, whether that is private corporate infrastructures or public cloud infrastructures. And so as a result, this is both, I would say, a threat as well as an opportunity. I mean, particularly for providers like us, where we have been evangelizing the benefits of cloud technologies for over 20 years now. We are delighted to actually enter a domain where it hasn't yet been pervasive and it's relatively new, et cetera, right? I mean, it's just kind of a whole new world in terms of us being able to go and work with the telecom providers to help them digitally transform. But also to continue that thought process as you laid out, they don't have an option but to change. And so many of them are in fact realizing this. We've had great success working with carriers globally now over the course of the last, 3 years or so, beginning that transformation. Now, in the past, they have had the benefit of 10, 15-year cycles where each generation of wireless technology would give them sort of a bell curve of 15 years to go acquire subscribers, get that to peak, transition out of the older technology, and then, of course, then start thinking about the next generation and then go down the other side of the bell curve. These curves are starting to get compressed. So they don't have 15 years anymore to be thinking about their next transformation cycle. It's really upon them today. And I would essentially say for everyone that is thinking about playing a significant role in this next generation of enterprise as well as consumer communications, they had better transform themselves today. They should be thinking about how do they get to be agile service providers now, or they could get killed in the process. And by the way, many of them are starting to do this. There is the pressure of top line growth, new services delivery, as well as the pressure of bottom line costs and what it's going to take them to stand up and operationalize a 5G infrastructure. When you bring these together, you really have to look at a software-defined, digitally transformed architecture to say, how can I create a service over the course of the next week and have it launched over the course of the next 5 weeks, instead of thinking about a service over the course of the next 2 years and having it launched over the next 5 years, right? And you're exactly right in the characterization of the industry, but I'm much more optimistic about their ability to transform because the pressures are on them right now.
That brings us down to VMware and its role in this process. How do you help them, or how do you plan to help them, and I presume have been helping them in this transformation?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, because 4 years back, I would have said we don't really have anything to do with carriers and telecom service providers and their transformation, other than perhaps to help the CIO take their internal data center environments and virtualize them. So that was our business for forever, and we had that business also with all the carriers, and we continued that. But what we did about 4 years back was to hone in on a trend that was known as NFV, or Network Functions Virtualization. And in very simple terms, you can think about this as telecom infrastructure really having historically cell towers, spectrum, fiber, and then some gear in their base stations and central offices that enable the transformation of the wireless protocols to things that would in fact be bits that are carried on top of the network, right? And that is what the operator's infrastructure looks like. The historic provision of that gear in the operator central office and base stations was all done by 3 or 4 providers. I mean, the likes of Ericsson and Nokia and Huawei and so on. And they were all controlled protocol boxes that really nobody could open up or do anything with. What has happened over the course of the last 3 years, particularly with the NFV transition, is that it has enabled people like us to come in and take more industry standard software and bring that to the benefit of the carriers, saying you can use industry standard hardware, industry standard software, and take developers and build applications on top of this architecture, much like the IT side of the house used to do for their internal applications, their productivity applications. So there is no real need to regard this domain as completely different and not being able to leverage the technologies that have been beneficial on the IT side. And since we've had a long history on the other side, we've now quickly brought that to the attention of all the carriers to say how they can systematically go in, take all of the functions that were historically provided by these boxes, and then make them software defined and software delivered on top of VMware software. So an analogy I like to use with many of the folks I talk to is your cellular phone and the applications that you have on the phone. So today, a smartphone, typically most of us as users have at least somewhere between 25 to 100 apps that we use, some of them more frequently than the others. But imagine if somebody told you that you had to actually carry one phone for every app, then you would literally be lugging like 50 phones on your back, and you would be figuring out which phone to use for what app. And it's just not a tenable environment. The operator infrastructure environment sort of resembles that. They have been historically told you've got to have a phone for this and a phone for this and a phone for this. Whereas if you now think about the transformation that we are leading from VMware, we're saying you can have a common infrastructure foundation, have this be an app and an app and an app, all defined in software on top of this common foundation, right? I mean, that's what we are doing. That's the transformation we are leading. We have done that now with the core of the operator network, and we are now leading the charge to go into I'd say the bigger part, which is the access network or the radio side of what operators are doing.
So you spoke about the telcos having a fragmented and inflexible environment. I presume a big part of this approach towards less fragmentation and more flexibility is the concept of microservices. Can you elaborate on the role that they will play in this environment and, generally speaking, the power of microservices?
Sure. So in fact, even before we go into microservices, Arthur, we should talk about services themselves, because the historic telco has often really thought only about data and voice to a consumer as the two big services that they create and deliver. Most of their monetization comes out of these two. And so they have been in a, I would say, on a treadmill where they've always just said, okay, how do I figure out how to get the next best phone to my consumer? And then how do I increase the ARPU for subscribers based on how much data and voice they consume, right? I mean, that's been the, I'd say, mentality. So the first departure is the idea that you can, in fact, have more services. So you can start deploying new things. You can think about, I don't know, IoT services or new network services to the enterprise, or for the consumer, you can have, like I said, travel services and gaming services, and you can think about things in a different way compared to just generic network connectivity. Now, in order to go into this sort of thinking, you really do need to do two things. One is the architecture needs to be more service oriented and service definable. And then, of course, as a telco, you also need to have the sales and marketing muscle to think about how you would go and sell these services to whoever your customers are. Now, we're, of course, focused a lot more on the first part, not as much on the second part in assisting our carriers, but increasingly we'll probably do that as well. Now, on the first part, in order to go from rigid architectures to service-oriented architectures, like I said, you've now got to think about common foundations, flexibility, the ability to go in and define and create and be agile and launch in a service. If you then double click on that, you get to microservices, which say, okay, a big honking service doesn't need to be one gigantic thing. It can, in fact, be composed of smaller microservices. They can be, again, created on the fly and maybe even destroyed on the fly if you only need them for certain amounts of time. They can be done in a more cloud-native, containerized environment. And that microservices architecture then becomes, like I said, a pretty important aspect of how services that get created and then the whole thing gets launched. And then on the other side, if you now have people that are defining and devising these services, and then you have a pipeline that very quickly operationalizes them, launches them, and then you have a marketing team that decides on pricing and packaging and how to take it to market, whether you are consumers or business customers. Now you have like the full supply chain of what you need to be a successful communications provider for the future. But like I said, we've started the transition on the infrastructure side. And then as these things are now becoming evident, operators are also starting to think about what they need to price and market and launch these services.
That makes me think of another sector that has behaved in a very similar fashion to telecommunications, which is financial services. They were among the first to give the consumer and many businesses an experience of the cloud with online banking. And you would think that they had led the digital revolution and would be digitally transformed themselves, but they're in the same boat as the telcos, it would appear. And the fact that they're still operating silos, that you can't link your, for example, in some banks, your home loan account with your current account. In others, where they start providing online share trading, there's no connection between that platform and your banking platform, which tells us that they're really operating in very defined silos. And that's the opposite of true digital transformation, at least so it seems to me. And the banks seem to have great difficulty in adapting their legacy infrastructure. And perhaps those very words explain the reason, is that they have so much legacy infrastructure, but adapting that to the needs of digital transformation. Does the cloud and virtualization and microservices help them to address it in the same way as you are doing with the telcos?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say your observation is right again, in that there are many vertical industries that are not quite as far as we would have expected them to be in their transformation. I mean, banking is one, healthcare is another one, right? And in some ways, I would say right now, both because of the advances that we have made technologically, as well as the unfortunate consequences of things like COVID and remote work and what we are all going through in terms of how we have to adapt quickly to unplanned catalysts, we have to have an agile infrastructure faster than we have ever done before, right? And so the toolkit, the raw materials are all now available and becoming apparent to everybody in each industry. And to some extent, it feels like the perfect storm to me, which is now you've got the simmering ability to get a whole bunch of like developers and invite them in and say, be our guest and go transform the banking industry, be our guest and go transform the healthcare industry and go transform the communications industry. And while all of us like the fact that we can now communicate across the globe on a video conference like this, there is no doubt in my mind that even 5 years from now, we will be thinking about this as an archaic form of communication. Like today, we think about the 28K modems from whatever the 80s, right? That the pace of transformation is going to be so immense in the next 5 years that we would actually wonder, oh my God, remember those days where we could, like, we had to boot up a Zoom call and connect with each other. But that's sort of, to your point, I think there are many industries, financial services being one of them, which have not taken the full advantage of the technologies that are available to them. And a lot of it is, I would say there's a good bit of it, which is around an API-driven architecture to go and access and create applications. And then there is the other side of it, which is more regulatory. And so I think as long as the other side can equally be addressed in areas like financial services as well as healthcare, or for that matter, government and federal businesses and so on, then I think we've now got the ability to go and transform in the course of the next 2-3 years.
You made a fascinating comment in your keynote address that the remote working revolution has led to a spike in demand in high quality residential connectivity. And we know that there's an increased demand for connectivity and increased data use. In South Africa, it apparently spiked by something like 40% in the first couple of months of lockdown. But how do you support that kind of growth in demand? How do you ensure not just connectivity, but quality connectivity for the residential market that is working remotely and therefore part of the enterprise world, but divorced from it in a way as well?
Yeah, so we do it in two ways, Arthur. One is if you think about the end users and the people that are at the endpoints with their phones and laptops and mechanisms for connectivity, we have a solution from VMware called Workspace Management. Historically, Workspace Management was sold to the enterprise for employees of a company that were often inside the confines of a building, a campus, etc. What has happened through the course of this year is that in most companies, if not all, everybody is operating from remote environments. I mean, typically their homes or wherever they are operating out of. So as a result, it has required a blending of the corporate policy environment with the ability to be remote and work from home. And so the combination of technologies that we have used for workspace management, as well as things like SD-WAN for branch connectivity and for the ability to increase the bandwidth in order to make sure that people are communicating over constrained pipes and lines. We've managed to bring these together to the benefit of remote workers and anyone who is operating out of home environments. And that has both been a spike for us in terms of our applicability to this business, but it's also been a great boon to the corporate workforce that is now globally distributed and working from homes. Now, that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is more the pipes that are underneath the covers, which is the business that I just explained to you so far. Working with the carriers, enabling them to now get more agile with creation of services and delivery of services, now enables you to have a back-end infrastructure that is equally capable of now supporting the increasing demand of these front-end endpoints and corporate workers. So as you start distributing these people, giving them more capability on how they communicate, all that traffic and bandwidth then lands on the back-end infrastructure. And if this is not able to be agile and supportive, then you've only kind of improved one side, but you've not made that or married that with what's happening on the back end. So we do both. We've helped the front end through workspace management and better connectivity solutions for branch and SD-WAN. And we've also now enabled the carriers to get the benefit of cloud technologies so that they can be agile in their service creation.
I'm conscious that we're over time. I know obviously people have busy diaries. So Shekar, have you got time to answer maybe one more question if Arthur has one?
Sure. And if you have a last question, Arthur, I'm happy to answer. And of course, if you want more time later, happy to do that too.
Thank you. Let's bring this down to the data center. You are providing an agile and scalable telco cloud infrastructure for the telcos. How does that then translate back into the data center? What is 5G giving to the data center?
Yeah, so I would say that there are two types of data centers here. So there's one level of data center, which is the telcos operating their own data centers. And then there are data centers that are corporate data centers. So if you think about large corporations and their compute infrastructure, their data centers have already been, I'd say, digitally transformed and made virtual using VMware technology. And that is, I mean, we have a footprint of over 500,000 corporate customers globally in terms of how they're using it for their on their business premises and data centers. The telco data centers, as we have explained, have been historically not software defined, not virtualized, etc. So if you now dissect a telco or a carrier inside that operations of a telecommunications carrier, you typically have their IT group and then you have their network group. The IT group takes care of almost their internal applications and their internal data center. The network group takes care of all the network operations of how they service customers. The IT group data centers have always been virtualized and software defined and have been much faster on the digital transformation curve. The network operations have not been. And so what we have now done is brought the benefit of this first part to the second part so that all the data centers can now operate in an agile way and you don't have this divide. And that's leading also to economic efficiencies. People are saying, okay, I don't really need two different architectures. I don't need two different, and in some cases, I don't need two different groups to manage all this. I can actually have a common set of people that have the similar skill sets and they are more adept at software architectures. And so this is now giving, I would say, a much more common denominator of operations for carriers globally.
But just the 5G aspect, if you don't mind elaborating on that.
Yeah.
What does 5G do that 4G didn't, for example?
Yeah, so if you think about the fact that you now can create applications, you can build them in a container and cloud native infrastructure, and you can take concepts like network slicing, which are unique to 5G, and make them operational end to end. This is now the benefit of taking 5G and the digital transformation and putting that together. You can literally go in and say a carrier can offer you a service for, I don't know, reading the newspaper at a certain rate versus checking the security in your home at a different rate versus playing games at a different rate. And you might have different qualities of service that you're willing to live with for each of these. You might be willing to live with different security parameters for each of these. And then they can say, this is the price per minute for this versus that versus that. You can also compare and contrast what carrier A does versus B for each of these services. And you can say, I want service A from carrier A, whereas this one I want from a different carrier. And I want to switch those depending upon which day of the month I'm dealing with them, right? And all of this can be done in an automated way, and it's not going to be anywhere as complicated as it might sound. But that's what the benefit of taking 5G and the digital transformation and bringing that together would bring us as users.
I look forward to that world. Thanks so much, Shekar. Thank you for your time.
Wonderful talking to you, Arthur.